If you enjoy listening to The Edge, support them by subscribing to The Edge on iTunes, Stitcher, and you can listen through the iHeartRadio app. Get busy listening.
This is The Edge.
Edge-show.com.
Edge lubricates as it lathers.
Edge-show.com.
Listen to the phone side, then listen to the Edge side.
Edge-show.com.
Phone, Edge.
Edge-show.com.
This is The Edge.
Hi, this is Mark. Welcome to the show. It's kind of a thrill for me this week because I am having as a guest someone I really wanted to turn you on to. He does a podcast called Hardcore History that I've become hooked on. And I wanted a historical perspective, honestly, on so much of the stuff that's going on right now. And Dan Carlin, our guest, can give us that historical perspective. He will bring some of that longer historical step back perspective to the day's events and where we are in our nation's evolution and the evolution of the world, for that matter. We'll start with Michael Shure, the Fest 15, politics, and more. Thanks for all the ways you support us. Thank you for sharing this podcast. Thank you for clicking on our Amazon click-through to buy there. They spin off a little bit of whatever you buy, and we get something to support our show. Thank you for leaving something to PayPal. Thank you for your positive reviews. Thank you for your subscriptions. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's get started.
You're listening to The Edge. Join us on the web at edge-show.com.
We start with the Fast 15 minutes of politics and some other stuff as well. Michael Shure joins us. Yeah!
Thank you. It's good. It's good to be here. The 15 really do fly by, too.
Yes, they do. They just settled that United Airlines thing. The guy was pulled off the flight. He settled, but no one's saying exactly what he got.
No, but their lawyer, without being specific, said that United, and I think there's a quote, really stepped up to the plate, and I believe it. I have to tell you something, Mark. Tell you, not sell you. There's things I'd like to sell you to, but I want to tell you. I think United Airlines done really well. I think it was a huge mistake. It was so poorly handled. It was a disaster in the immediate aftermath to the way that Munoz, their CEO, dealt with it. Since that time, though, they have announced major changes, have reacted as positively as they can to their shortcomings. I think they've done a brilliant job. I would have no qualms about buying a ticket on United.
I thought that they were given a little bit of a hard time early on when I felt clearly it was mishandled on the spot. And I thought, well, that's a localized situation.
Yeah.
There's nothing institutionally wrong with United Airlines. But then the CEO came out, and I know what he was trying to do. He was trying to say, hey, I back my people. And
right.
They have to, but that was the wrong thing to say in that instant after a guy had been so mauled the way that this guy was.
Yeah, it probably was. I mean, it definitely was. And listen, I think the thing that was the most abhorrent about what you heard, it was not necessarily what you saw, because everybody knows that the police did that. It wasn't United Airlines sending in the goons to beat this guy up, right? That was overdone by the airport police there. Just the notion that you would displace passengers for your employees doesn't sit well with anyone, and defending that didn't sit well with people. But then, listen, they're totally changing what they do. Every employee is going to be empowered now with an app to give you miles whenever there's some sort of, discourtesy that's been presented to you. You can get up to $10,000 to be rebooked. They're no longer going to be displacing passengers once you're in your seat. They made changes that are industry changing. I mean, this is what happened to United could have happened to any of the big carriers. It just happened to United that day. But this is changing the way the industry runs, and they're being leaders in it. And I don't own a penny of stock in them. I choose to fly with other airlines mostly just because of where I'm going. But I'm impressed by the way they've dealt with it since then. And I think that when you screw up, right, there's the punishment for screwing up, but there has to then be the reward for doing the right thing. When you step away from it.
You're saying at this point, look, we get it. We've dumped on United Airlines. They've been the butt of jokes and and the object of ridicule now for a few weeks. So give them some credit for stepping up and making it right.
Right, and this fire the coach mentality that we all have. This, as soon as there's someone does something wrong, we're the perfect ones and they're the imperfect ones, right? Well, if you fire the coach and you don't change the sort of culture of the team, they're going to keep losing, or the problems are going to still stay there. So this guy actually, I think, did a good job after all has been said and done, and I think kudos to United.
There's a lot going on in technology. I was seeing a couple of pieces, one of which was how apps and different underground networks in China permit communications in a society that doesn't allow internet communications the way we're used to it here.
Yeah. Nobody's ever, by the way, opened up a conversation with, there's a lot going on in technology. Let's turn now to Michael Shure. So
I'm just saying because
I'm flattered.
Because you're a journalist.
Right.
I mean, imagine being there in China and having to get word out and get to sources.
Of course. And that also, we talked before about changing the way things are done in a permanent way. That will change things by default because of, the technology is going to change. It's not going to be able to let people and governments and bosses and companies rein things in the way they've been able to in the past.
There are changes in this country at the FCC. As you know, there's an FCC commissioner who is all for getting rid of net neutrality.
Yeah.
Net neutrality, of course, says that everything is coming into you on the internet at the same speed. It's neutral. The net is neutral.
Yeah.
He wants to get rid of that and is going to get rid of it because he's on a jihad about it. It's one of his real front and center issues. And that will allow industry to really determine what things come to you at what pace.
Yeah, and when he first started, Forbes wrote an article that I linked to in my Twitter feed because I read it and it was contrary to everything I had read about this guy. That's not his mission. He doesn't even care that much about net neutrality. He wants to make sure there's a level playing field for everyone, et cetera, et cetera. And the Forbes article was well written, and I think Forbes generally, you get good articles out of them in terms of I think they have good journalists there. They're a little conservative sometimes, obviously, but I think that the notion that this guy was not going to care about net neutrality is positively naive now, and I think that that's one of the things certainly that this administration doesn't know very much about. And it matters to a lot of people, and it's going to matter to more and more people, small businesses, independent users, people who don't want who want unfettered access to news and information. I think it's gonna hurt.
Nonprofits, if somebody wants to start a charity in the name of their son that died in a car wreck, and they're raising money for an event, or they're just trying to get subscribers, they will take a back seat on that internet bus to Netflix, Hulu.
For sure,
any kind of media outlet with big money behind it will push out the little guy because you're going to have to pay to get a real bandwidth that's going to matter and to arrive onto people's devices in any kind of timely fashion.
Right, and that's hugely problematic, and we all know who that favors, and so it's not surprising that the people that know enough to care about it on either side have pretty strong opinions about it too.
I saw something about Instagram that really blew me away. Instagram is this app, obviously, where people post pictures, and you see this maybe aspirational world of everybody's on a private jet and they're at Coachella, or they're at Ibiza, or they're in Paris, or literally, it looks like everybody's life is just jamming all the time,
right? Constantly, right?
Because when you take a picture, what do they say? Smile, right? So you're always everybody looks happy.
That's really funny.
It can be.
Mundane Instagram would be great. Like to start an entirely new app of I'm getting into my car. Here's me getting into my car.
Well, there is some of that on Instagram. It's not like everything is well curated. A lot of
I'm sure I'm not on. Are you on it?
I go there a lot, actually, and I'm not alone because there's 700 million users, and Instagram, as you know, was purchased by Facebook. It was
Wait, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. You answered that like a politician.
What?
I said, are you on it? Are you on Instagram? You said, I go there a lot.
No, I am.
Do you have an account? You have an account?
Of course. I'm on it.
All right, that's good.
No,
I'm
saying I'm on it. I don't mean to be political about it. I'm Mark
Yeah.
Thompson TV. Please, Mark Thompson TV. All you grammars out there, please follow me.
Oh, look, Grammar's on your Insta.
Yeah. I don't even know if that's what they call it, gramming. I just made
They
it
do
up
call it Insta, by
in
the
this
way.
in this moment. They call it Insta? No, they don't.
They do, yeah. I was looking to see if that was my son, and because he was supposed to text me, and he's the one who says he was on Insta. I'm on Insta. You're on Insta.
Wow.
Insta they do call it Insta.
I thought they call it IG.
I've not heard that.
Anyway, I don't know. Maybe somebody can tell us, but not really important. More to the point is it's blowing up. I mean, everybody's on it.
They do say it's blowing up.
Yeah.
I mean, some people say IBU, but If they shorten, it's blowing up. But
Nobody says it's going like hotcakes anymore.
no, they don't.
No, that
I
is
said
dumb.
hogwash on TV the other day, and I stopped in the middle of the segment, and I said, "I can't believe I just said
Yeah,
hogwash."
that really is
Yeah.
1957.
But I was saying that people were saying it's hogwash, and I said, I can't believe I just said hogwash.
All right, back to Instagram.
Yeah.
700 million users. And Facebook did something very smart, which is kind of what Facebook does all the time, it seems. They bought Instagram in 2012, and they paid $1 billion for it.
Wow.
So that's just 5 years ago. And Instagram has blown up at a pace that has even exceeded Facebook's rate of growth.
It's amazing.
And now, it was $1 billion in 2012. That was the valuation of Instagram. That's what they paid for it.
All right.
Now, what is it worth?
It's $1 billion.
In 5 years ago.
Yeah. I'm going to say, I have no idea. I'm going to say it's worth $6.4 billion.
Right, and that would be reasonable. That's more than $1 billion growth in valuation every year in that 5 years.
But I'm guessing I'm wrong.
$37 billion.
That's unbelievable.
Evaluation.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It really is.
And you know what's funny? I'm only on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook, and I'm not on Instagram. And Twitter, of course, this is typical me. I pick the one that's worth nothing, that they can't monetize, and nobody knows how to do anything with it.
It's collapsing.
Right. Exactly. It's going under because I think it's because I'm on it. And I'm on it all the time, and I love the format. I'm not tempted by the others. Now, my son has told me that I have to get on Instagram because that's where the world is going, hearing you talking about it. But it just seems, again, like another distraction.
No, for information and for news, Twitter is where I go.
Right.
It is not rivaled in any way by Instagram.
Right.
So if you care about news and you care about information, you care about sort of being current with what's happening, I think you have to stay on Twitter right now the way these platforms are set up. Now, they may change Instagram in some ways to accommodate that, but for click-throughs on articles that are interesting, for even deep dives that you can do through some of these links, it's all on Twitter.
Yeah, I feel like if you like 60 Minutes, you like Twitter. If you like The Real Housewives, you like Instagram.
Right, and that's not quite fair, but I think
I'm sure it's not fair, but
no, I think that's a decent shorthand.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure it's not fair. But it sounded good, right?
The other thing I saw that was related to technology that I just thought you'd get a kick out of is casino gaming now. They're finding that younger people need to have screens that light up. They need to have some kind of video component. So they're trying to create all the different games that you'd find in table games I'm talking about.
Right.
But they're making them video games because that's bringing in more millennials.
It's incredible. I've been to casinos. I've seen these virtual reality blackjack games,
right,
where there's an actual screen of a dealer, and he's talking to you over a speaker, and there are people sitting around, and he's dealing the cards, and it's electronic. And the great thing about being a gambler is you look at it and you think, well, I'm not going to do that. There's no way you can win, right? So you're going to go about 24 yards away, and there's a real person, and you're going to do that.
And that's where you can't win.
That's where you can't win either, yeah.
They're really doing this in such a big way. It's the most expanding new trend, I think, in casinos, and so you'll find one. I've always been struck with the video thing that you're kind of presuming a lot of honesty in that.
Right.
You're presuming that there are 52 cards in that deck, and whatever.
That's what I mean. It's the you can't win. And listen, some of the experience of being at a casino is the interaction with the people that are taking your money, who work there, and. So will it go away? I mean, do they think this is the beginning of the end? Like, older people are the wealthier people now.
Right now, it's true.
It usually is.
Right.
And so,
but the next wave, the next generation that is going to be wealthy, so many of these millennials who are building wealth and will be the customers of the future, they're attracted to this video.
Right.
So these screens, they cannot fill the orders quickly enough.
Wow.
So that's the trend. If you see more of them, it's not by accident.
Do you think we could get one for Edge World headquarters? Do you think?
I'd love that.
Yeah, actually, you would.
I'd love that. I think the way they work is you have to lease them. You can't buy them.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so we can look into it.
And there are people who have. There was a game in Vegas called Caribbean Stud, right? You've seen it,
of
right?
course, yeah.
You don't see it anymore. And I asked about it because it was a great way, because you could lose money slowly there as opposed to the other games. So it was a great way to inhale and exhale while you were getting slammed at the other games. You go there, you can spend 2 hours, and it'll take you. Lose
That's probably why they got rid of it.
Yeah, well, that's part of the reason why. But somebody owned it. Somebody owned the game, leased the name and the right to play it, and the casinos finally said, "Hey, we're not gonna pay to do this anymore," and so it's gone.
You know, I was watching Shark Tank one time, and Famous Amos from Famous Amos Cookies came on.
Wally Amos.
And he had sold, speaking of the Caribbean Stud Poker and selling that, he had sold Famous Amos. And the name Famous Amos, couldn't even use it anymore.
Right.
And he was there on Shark Tank with a new cookie that he was pitching.
Really?
Yeah. And I kind of felt bad for him.
Of course. I didn't even know he was still alive, Wally Amos.
He's, I guess, trying to get money for
He must be pretty old.
his next cookie. All right, now let's see how old he is.
Wally Amos. So give me I'm going to make a guess on how old Wally Amos is. Okay. I'm going to say that Wally Amos.
Good knowledge on knowing his first name.
I'm going to say that Wally Amos is 76.
Seems about right. He looks great, by the way, and he is 80.
80.
Born
so that's what I'm saying. And not that 76 or 80 are old, but they're not Shark Tank age. Right?
Yeah.
I'm going to invest in this guy.
Right. It's hey, listen, Sharks, take the ride with me for the next 4 months before I'm at Cedars-Sinai.
Yeah.
Michael Shure, want to see more of you.
You will.
I'll see you at a
virtual gaming spot near us.
I'll see you in a video blackjack game soon. Yes!
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Great to see you again this week.
I want to thank you for all the ways that you support my friends on the Edge podcast. And if you haven't already, why don't you show your support and subscribe? What's the matter with you? Go to Edge Show. Oh, it's Edge Dash. What's with the dash? Stupid. All right, I want to thank you for all the ways that you support my friends on the Edge podcast. Show your support and leave something on their website, edge-show.com. Stupid. Why is there a dash?
edge-show.com.
People ask me all the time what podcasts I listen to. And the podcast that I always mention first is from Dan Carlin, who is our guest today. I am a huge fan of Dan Carlin, and I got hooked on something that he calls hardcore history, which you'll find in all the places you find podcasts. And then he does a podcast called Common Sense, and I like that podcast too. Hi, Dan Carlin.
Thank you for having me on. How are you?
I'm very well. I really am honored to have you on. You have one of the most popular podcasts in all of podcast world. And one of the things that strikes me at this critical time in history, and I suppose everything's a critical time in history, but this move to saber rattle with a lot of nations that we've now seen has made me particularly aware of all the different times in history that this sort of thing has happened and how easy it is to sort of back into an exchange that ends up in a real war accidentally. And nothing makes me so acutely aware of that as some of the stuff that you've covered on your podcast. And again, there's no political agenda in Dan's podcast, Hardcore History. He just goes through historical fact, but you bring stuff to life. I wonder if you could just review for us, since I started in this place, how easy is it to get into war? Am I wrong? It seems like the kind of thing that nations back into through time.
Well, Napoleon had a good line once. He said that states that wish to stay at peace should avoid the pinpricks that turn into cannonballs. And I think what we're probably noticing when we look at situations that could explode into conflict is that given the roll of the dice, once you start rolling the dice, there's enough historical examples to show when things do tumble into worst case scenarios. So I think once we start playing with fire, everyone starts noticing that sometimes that leads to bad outcomes. Doesn't always lead to bad outcomes, and sometimes some people would argue you have to get in there and roll the dice a few times for good things to happen too. But I think those of us who tend to lean toward the little bit cynical or pessimistic side can't help but notice that the glass is half empty throughout a lot of history and worry about worst case scenarios.
Well, because a lot of these wars that we get into, they are much bigger and harder to get out of than one might have thought.
Oh, I think that's always the case, don't you? I mean, the idea of committing to a concept and a plan and an action is always going to be a lot easier than once you're in it, waist deep trying to deal with it. And of course, even more importantly, in terms of a military situation, deciding you don't like it anymore and wanting to get out. Yeah, absolutely. Getting in is a lot easier than getting out. I mean, how often have we been told best case scenario potential outcomes? And I think that's normal. There are glass half full people just like there are glass half empty people. And then you turn out to find that these things are much more complicated and involve so many thousands of variables that are difficult to assess ahead of time that once you're in there, you might sit there and go, maybe we should have thought a little bit more about this before we got waist deep into it. And I think you have lots of examples of people stumbling into war. The First World War, now that it's the century anniversary, is getting a lot of attention from people. Century anniversary of the U.S. involvement anyway in 1917. A lot of people are looking at that once again and noticing how little pinpricks turn into cannonballs sometimes, and it would be nice if we could avoid that again.
Well, it's funny you mentioned World War I because you talk and really bring to life the fact that World War I started very accidentally.
Well, yeah, and I think basically what a lot of people might say is that the stage was set for something bad to happen when the First World War broke out, and the famous assassination by Gavrilo Princip of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary was just the spark that lit the gasoline-soaked wood, if you will, that was laying around in 1914 on fire. But if it hadn't been that, it likely would have been something else. I think you see moments like that in history all the time. And I think that's what worries people, for example, if you look at the situation in North Korea today, and you say, okay, we're in a temporary situation involving a potential standoff, but even if this moment were to die down and things return back to normalcy, in a month, in a year, you're still dealing with the gasoline-soaked wood around that current issue, meaning we're likely to revisit a moment down the road where once again we find that we're worried about fire starting and sparks going off. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in fact, I think that sort of is the thing that prompts me to begin this conversation with you with questions about war, because it feels as though there's an anxiety now in the nation that didn't exist in as palpable a form for many, many years. I grew up with the Russian scare. We actually ducked our heads under the desk and did all of that. The real threat of some kind of bomb coming that could do us all in. That receded, that anxiety, but now it seems as though that anxiety is returning.
Well, it's funny how quickly we can forget that it was even there and how quickly it can come back with just, a little bit of a scare here or there. We had said in one of the podcasts that we did on nuclear weapons that if you were born with a gun pointed at your head, do you stop noticing, or do you even notice that that's the case anymore? We forget that even though the Cold War ended and that acute moment that you talked about where we were doing duck and cover drills in school in case a nuclear weapon went off, just because the Soviet Union went away, just because tensions temporarily died down, doesn't mean the weapons aren't there. Doesn't mean that that's still not a potential future that we might all have to confront. But it's human nature to sort of relax, let your guard down and go, oh, glad that period in history is over. I think what people are seeing with the North Korean thing is just a different version of the same worry, which is these weapons are out there, and just because the former power we were worried might use them against us is gone, doesn't mean you're safe from anyone using the weapons. This is like a weird sort of funhouse mirror version of deja vu for people who grew up in the generation that you and I did.
Exactly. And it's funny you talk about North Korea, because I think you're right to touch on the fact that although it has come and gone in various amplifications along the way, the fear of North Korea, the ultimate fact of their nuclear ambitions hasn't changed. Has the rest of the world around this North Korean situation changed from a historical perspective in any way that matters?
Oh, I think so. I think the last time that we were wondering about the dynamics, probably in a very big sense, was during the Cold War, when China was a communist country that was on one side of, maybe you could say, a triad. The Soviet Union was another one, again, another country that doesn't exist. And then there's us, and then there's post-war Japan. I mean, the last time we were dealing with a shooting war in Korea, the circumstances were so unbelievably different that you wonder how it would turn out today. And I think some of what's happening right now may be the equivalent of some of the glaciers around North Korea thawing and moving into new directions, and maybe you could even argue destabilizing a situation that had been kind of locked or frozen into place for a long time. And of course, as any political science teacher would probably say, that provides an opportunity maybe for something good to happen. but also the instability is the roll of the dice that we talked about earlier, where, you just don't know. And you always hope that these things land on their feet somewhere down the road. But when you're actually living in them and the future is foggy and unclear, you just keep your fingers crossed. I mean, this is the time when you're always hoping everybody acts in a really wise way when it comes to international affairs.
Although it doesn't feel as though you have a lot of wise minds coming to this party in the sense that everybody wants to be a wild card. I mean, our new president, we can talk about maybe if we have time later, the historical framework that might have led to his rise. But our new president brags about sort of being unpredictable. We know that the ruling head of North Korea is, we would call him crazy. He's starving out his people. He's throwing all his money into weaponry, and he's blasting off all these missiles every chance he gets. So it doesn't seem as though a lot of wise minds are at the party.
I always wonder whether or not it ever did, because I think we do a little like when I was studying Roman history, they always say that the Romans used to always look back towards a golden age when everything like leadership and all that stuff was of a much higher caliber. But they were probably imagining that there was ever a golden age there. And I wonder if we don't do the same thing where, I pine away for these presidents and leaders of old who would get us out of these situations and use so much more wisdom. But I bet if we were living during that time period, it might look just as precarious and just as like we had a Captain Ahab at the ship of state as we do now. Because when you go back and you read the primary source materials from even 40 or 50 years ago, they don't seem all that trusting of the leaders that they have steering the ship back then either. Or maybe we're grading on a curve. I mean, I always like to say, because I like to see the reaction other people have, that, boy, wouldn't it be great to have someone with a foreign policy mind like Richard Nixon right now? And everybody just goes crazy because of where Nixon stands in our political memory.
Yeah, the rest of the baggage.
That's right. But you wonder if grading on a curve, anybody from 40 or 50 or 60 years ago looks good to us now. So that may be fooling ourselves a little bit, but we're just pining away for a golden age, maybe.
You've mentioned a couple of things I really want to get to. I hope you talk a lot about in the eyes of history when you get enough distance between wherever you are and some historic event, maybe even a horrible war. I mean, maybe even a genocide. If you get enough distance between the now and that time and event, the impressions that it leaves are distinctly different than those that it is leaving closer to the event.
Well, and that's a basic tenet of history, right? The old line that you can't write history until a certain amount of time has elapsed. I think before that time has elapsed, it's supposed to be called journalism. And then somewhere along the way, journalism morphs into history, I guess. And most of the time that's beneficial, right? Because you know how the story turns out. You can look at events from sort of a godlike perspective from above and see where roads less taken weren't taken and all those kind of things. And I would say mostly that's good, and that's the prevailing idea that has governed historians forever. But there is something you lose that I think helps you connect with the people from the past. You lose the emotions, which is both an advantage and a disadvantage. It's an advantage because you see things more clearly without the emotions. But without the emotions, you also don't see things as the people then did. I mean, for example, and we talked about this in a history show. I mean, what if you try to write the experience that we all we're in the near run after effects from, but the Holocaust and the Second World War? What happens when that's 500 years ago? And no one knows or remembers any of the actual victims, when the emotions have cooled? Are you going to be able to look at an emotional occurrence like that and really get a good feel for it when the part that is so strong to us now is the part that's missing? So, I mean, it's this double-edged sword where I think most of the time it helps you get a better sense of the truth and the reality of the situation. But if the emotions have cooled, the price you pay for that extra wisdom maybe leaves out a key ingredient. And a lot of times the key ingredient is the part that says, don't ever do this again. This is so horrible. I mean, if you don't remember how horrible the Holocaust is, maybe that statement never again doesn't quite have the sort of punch that it resonates with in my generation, in your generation. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but that's always been the viewpoint, that you have to have some time and distance under your belt before you can write a decent history about things.
Well, it's astounding even in maybe that time and distance is shorter. I went round and around with my father, I remember, and certainly my father has lived through, the shadow of World War II and the Korean conflict and all this. I went round and round with him on involvement in Iraq. during the Bush administration, because he felt that we could stabilize Iraq and be a beacon of democracy in this place, and he felt that it was our involvement there. To me, it seemed nakedly the same situation as Vietnam, it seemed so clearly a parallel that I was astounded that he was so vehement about involvement in Iraq. Now, I might have been wrong. I mean, maybe, but I mean, certainly getting into Iraq, I'm not trying to divert too long into the Iraq thing, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that one's historical memory, which gets to what you were saying, even if not a whole lot of time has passed. I mean, you talk about 500 years. My father, we're talking about 50 years. And he was still, for him, the memory of Vietnam was different than that which he felt was the prospect in Iraq.
I had a history teacher once that said that you really need to bear in mind always when you're studying the past what the institutional memory of the people back then contains. And so, like, one of the things I always notice as I get older, 20 years doesn't seem that long anymore. When I was 20, it was a lifetime, literally. So you look at these people who are the decision makers, like we spoke about earlier, in say, the U.S. government and the higher ups in the defense structure. These are all people who, during their entire life of responsibility, have been existing in one kind of world. For example, the post-Cold War world. We don't really have very many of the leaders anymore who came up in the era where you had to worry about another superpower. But now you have an entire generation, for example, of military thinkers and planners and strategists who come up in an area where essentially they exist in a lone superpower. So the concerns that they had, the institutional memory that they're working with is different than the military and defense leaders in the past. So, for example, when you look at in Iraq and you look at someone from your dad's generation, that's somebody who, by and large, with maybe the exception of Vietnam, was accustomed to the United States being able to go in and do exactly the things he thought might be possible in Iraq. Your generation and my generation, we grew up in an era where it was the post-Vietnam era, and we were very aware of the limitations even of great powers when you get into swampy, strange situations. And so I think that's an example of what I worry now with the institutional memory of our current planners. Do they even remember a time where you had to worry about the ability to hit back of another power? When you're dealing with Iraq, for example, and Saddam Hussein, he can hurt our military. He could cause problems, but there was never the same fear that the kids in the schoolrooms were going to have to do duck and cover drills like you and I had to do. So you always knew there was sort of a maximum level of damage they could do to you. It's a different story when you're talking North Korea, though, isn't it? Because especially if they perfect this weapon system where they can deliver a nuclear weapon to U.S. soil, all of a sudden the upper threshold of the damage that they could do to you in a worst-case situation becomes exponentially different. And it's been a long time since we've had military planners in situations of strategic concern where they've really had to worry about that potential. So it's sort of what you lose with the institutional memory question. And it's something I try to bear in mind during every era, because that institutional memory thing has been something that's been plaguing mankind since the very beginning.
Yeah, it makes total sense. In fact, you touch on the military. I'm going to ask you something about the military historically. One of the things that I like that Dan Carlin does in his podcast, Hardcore History, is he gives you two different perspectives, and here's what I mean. One is the perspective of the generals who are oftentimes nowhere near the conflict, and they're pushing big chess-type pieces somewhere in a situation room. And he gives you also the view of the soldier, of the military troop who's actually there, who's caught in the mud, experiencing the gas, whatever. I mean, and some of this comes to life in the letters that are written back to home. But what I'm getting to, Dan, is this. I always thought, at least I've come around to the fact that people who've really served in war know the horror of war and don't want to go back to war. And so when I look at the current administration, again, this is my perspective and my take, and I'm curious as to yours. With so many generals who are being elevated to this place of great power in the Trump administration, I'm always wondering, but don't those generals have a sense that war is really awful? And those guys who've actually got experience with war, who've actually gotten their boots dirty, who've gotten their boots bloody, they don't want to get us back into a war. That's not always the answer, even for these generals.
Well, I certainly think that generals definitely have the troops situation on their minds more often than civilians, because they do know what they go through. But, I'm reminded of a comment I heard once from a guy who became a professor at a Georgia institution after his military service was done. But he had served in the United States in the Second World War in the Pacific. His name was Eugene Sledge. And he wrote a famous book called With the Old Breed about his experiences in the Pacific. But he had a line once that I heard him give at a lecture where he said, anyone who's ever been even 100 yards behind the front line has no idea what it's like. That the people who really understand war are the people that are right there in the trenches, as opposed to even the general that might say, oh, I understand it, I fought it, I've been with the troops. Eugene Sledge's point was, yes, but if you never got within 100 yards of the front, then you really don't know. And Eugene Sledge was in the lecture I saw had said that he didn't think anybody who had been within 100 yards of modern war would send troops into that mess. Now, that's not as much of an anti-war statement as it is an acknowledgement of the absolute craziness of the environment. But I think there's even a lot of soldiers who didn't really, especially in the modern world now, see that kind of combat. I mean, even in the Vietnam War, which, when I was growing up was considered to be just so horrible, and yet you thought to yourself when you started studying the First World War that there's not a person on the planet who wouldn't have chosen to fight in Vietnam rather than in the First World War, because there's degrees of horror, if you will. And I don't think an American who's fighting today has experienced the degree of horror on a wide scale and the absolute craziness, for example, that all those generals understood from the Second World War, because we haven't been in one of those conflicts in a long time. So while I certainly think that the generals know a lot better than your average Joes and Janes and politicians, even the modern crop of generals has been relatively, shall we say, fortunate in the conflicts that they've been involved in, because we haven't had the really, really nasty ones in almost an entire lifetime. And thank goodness for that. But there is a line about, and I'm going to butcher it here, something about, that it's good that we remember how horrible war is, lest we grow too fond of it. That may be a Robert E. Lee quote. But that's maybe the only good thing you can think of about having really terrible conflicts in the recent past is, boy, it sure is front and center in your memory. And if there's any historical lessons to remembering the past, you don't have to remember too far,
That's exactly the point I was trying to make. That's reinforced by so many of the stories that I've heard and so much of the historical perspective that I hear on your podcast, Hardcore History. I mean, that World War I that you talk about the casualties alone. They're staggering. I mean, we're not even talking about the conditions that these guys have to live in month after month in the mud and in the whatever, the horror of the individual associated with World War I. But in casualties, staggering.
That is, you're very kind to insinuate that somehow I'm making this story interesting, but the stories themselves are so overwhelming that they're fascinating. I always say my job is so easy because I'm picking these subjects that are intriguing and interesting above and beyond anything I could even say. And so if I butcher it somehow, then I've really screwed up. I mean, if you can't make the First World War compelling, there's something wrong with you. So I appreciate the nice comments, but the true stars, if you will, of this historical story are these mind-blowing events that are sometimes distant and sometimes recent ancestors lived through, survived, rebuilt the world a couple times over from. And that's what I can never get my mind around. I never feel as weak as a person as when I read about all the things that people in the past have overcome, survived, endured. And whenever I'm thinking I'm having a pretty bad day, the best cure in the world is to pull down one of the books from the bookshelves and see what a really bad day, historically speaking, looks like. And all of a sudden, everything seems much better.
You're not, you say, a history teacher.
No, I was a history student. I have a simple BA in the field. When I was a newscaster, I had a buddy who kept saying, you should really be talking about history. That's really what you're good at. This newscasting's not for you.
Nice.
So I don't know if that was a backhanded compliment or...
Yeah, that was backhanded minus the compliment. Right. Yeah. So when did it hit you, hey, I really do want to sort of do some kind of electronic classroom with my love of history?
That's not even how I think about it, just so you know, because I'm not qualified to even teach an electronic classroom. When we started the podcast for history, I thought I was doing a show for people that already knew history, and I was going to tell all these twisty, weird Twilight Zone things about it. Because I figured then I'm not really telling you anything. I don't have to have any qualifications. I'm just going, wasn't it weird when this happened? And then without really understanding how it evolved, the show ended up attracting a completely different kind of audience than I thought it was going to. people that didn't always know the story that I was riffing about. And so little by little, it evolved to the point where we were giving information, which I've never felt completely comfortable with. Because if you've heard my show, one of the things we point out is how biased information is, how easy it is to misunderstand, how many different viewpoints there are, how easy it is to misinterpret it. But that turned into, by no design of my own, something people found fascinating too. In history, they call it historiography, the process of writing and creating and making history. Well, that's considered to be a really boring thing when you're a history major, that regular people would hate that. But as one guy wrote to me, he said, I had no idea that history was so controversial. I thought there was just like a math problem. This happened and that happened. He said, I didn't realize it was the equivalent of having Fox News or MSNBC and whichever surviving network station broadcast made it down into the history books. That's the viewpoint you have. And so people became fascinated with the very idea that history itself was so multidimensional, controversial, and that could be told from multiple viewpoints. So I can't take credit for this weird formula of ours, because it evolved naturally. I never would have thought I was a guy who should be telling you what happened, and I'm still not sure that's what I am when you listen to the show.
You do take pains to explain that there are different perspectives. And this is particularly relevant to the confrontations and historical occurrences of very, very long ago. I'm talking about during the Roman Empire, or even before that, where you're dealing with, again, my recollection might be fuzzy, but with a particular person who's chronicling things, but then you, Dan, say, but remember, this person has such and such a bias.
Yeah, and I think that's been the kind of thing that most people were surprised about. And that if you're a history nut like I am, you forget that that's something you learned a long time ago, but somebody who's more of a math person might not have considered, because, you don't have much exposure to math. If you're me, they don't have much exposure to history, maybe. But this idea that it's so controversial and that it's such a detective's game to try to, one, put the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together and then try to guess what you have in the missing spaces, which is what ancient historians do all the time. But also how you account for the fact that the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle you do have may be tainted or biased, or today we would use terms like racist or ethnocentrist, or for example, Julius Caesar, he wrote some great documents that have helped historians a lot, but they happen to deal with the story involving him. So what's the likelihood you're getting a non-biased view of that? So that's turned into a lot more of the program than I thought people would like, because we're responding to the fact that they're more interested in that side of the history question than we ever thought they would be.
I have a couple of questions about America historically, and then one about common sense, then I'm going to let you go. The argument that you're hearing more of, the admonition that came from Eisenhower about the American military complex. As you look back from historical perspective, and one of the things that I should quickly mention as an aside is that there's no political agenda to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. In fact, I listened with great attention and focus to see if was there anything but there's not one hint of what your political perspective is during all of these hours. So I'm asking the question again from that neutrality that you bring to it. Is there evidence in some way of this conspiracy of the military-industrial complex that forces us to take certain policy decisions that aren't necessarily the wisest, but they serve those interests?
Well, obviously we're in the realm of opinion now, but my attitude on this is that yes, what you think you're seeing, but not for the reasons maybe that we think we're seeing them. First of all, let's understand, as we all do, that there's no single explanation for anything in this world, that it's multi strands and trends and forces that are all interacting in certain ways. So, for example, when we talk about what Eisenhower was worried about, he was worried that the United States would become what he called a garrison state, that in order to take on the post-Second World War responsibilities that it was doing, that it would be forced to spend too much of its budget and too much of the lives of its children in order to support this effort. One, that's an age-old American fear, and Eisenhower was almost like a Norman Rockwell American from Middle America. I mean, he had those fears. At the same time, this is something that if it happened, I would suggest it was for mostly non-nefarious reasons. I mean, just take, for example, the question of money. There was, there's a conspiracy, for example. It's a pretty open one. So there's a lot of talk, for example, about something that's known, if you wanted to look it up, called military Keynesianism. It's the idea that the Second World War was what really got us out of the Great Depression. as a country, that it wasn't all these programs from Franklin Roosevelt. It was the military spending and the ramp up to that. And people who felt that way became very worried right around 1943 as the end of the Second World War began to be visible in the distance. And their worry was, okay, so if we turn off this amazing spending machine that we've turned on to supply the entire world with armaments, what's going to happen to the U.S. economy then? Are we just going to go back to the Great Depression? And so that became one of the many strands that were involved in that era, where you almost got into a situation where the impetus and all of the inertia was moving in a certain direction. And that's kind of what Eisenhower was talking about, almost like it would be tough to get out of this role of defending the world once you took it on, and it would be tough to give up the benefits to our economy if you decided tomorrow you didn't need all these weapons. It's a bit of a trap, and I think he was warning about the trap, and I don't think it's as nefarious as it is cheap money, easy. I mean, like I went to a military get together a while back, and I was surprised how much of the strategy session about, for example, the future in the Middle East revolved around selling spare military parts to powers in that region. But it is so amazingly lucrative, and there's so much money that it would be weird if that wasn't a concern. And I would suggest that if you sat down and actually broke down the reasons that the situation Eisenhower was talking about was a problem, a lot of them would be things we would completely understand today and be very confounded by too, like, what do you do with the U.S. economy if you turn off all this military spending all of a sudden and we have a second Great Depression? So I guess the answer to the question is, I think what you think you're seeing and what Eisenhower warned about was real. But I think the reasons for it are a lot more mundane and understandable. That doesn't make them more solvable, but it makes them less conspiratorial and dark and subversive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. In fact, that's fascinating. It makes a lot of sense. It's interesting, though, that this president rode to power with a lot of sloganism and with a lot of ideas. If you want to, sloganism might have a little bit of a negative to it, but I'm just saying with a philosophy as perhaps played out in slogans that have to do with the military. And I think that people rallied, I'm talking about, again, the electorate, rallied around that military idea, like, yeah, we do have to build up the military again. Now, that's not for an economic reason. That's not for that military Keynesianism you're talking about. That's out of some patriotism represented by the military. It feels very primal or machismo to me.
Yeah, I didn't understand the agenda, because on one hand, he was talking about, we're not going to defend the world anymore. We're not going to be the policemen of the world, but we're going to build the military so big and powerful, you've never seen anything like it. Well, I always thought the main advantage of choosing one route over the other was that you either have the large military for the expanded role, or you have a shrinking role which allows you to cut the military. To me, it always looked like he was picking the worst of both worlds. Does that make sense?
Right.
The worst combination.
Yeah, it made no sense. I want to ask you about something I hear a lot about, and again, I need a historical perspective on that. And
I'll see if I can give that.
Okay. It's the argument that America was a great empire, and like all great empires in history, America's twilight days have arrived. And now you're seeing the diminution of all the power of America, the overspending, the last gasps, if you will, personified by a president who is this nationalist kind of guy. There's a sense, and you hear it all the time, that like all empires, America is an empire that's in its twilight days. Can you look at it from that historical perspective? Have all empires kind of have this arc?
Well, we can bow tie some of this conversation now, because this is exactly why you need more distance from current events for us to have this conversation, because you don't know where we're going to be in 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. And without knowing that, it's difficult to draw some conclusions about where we are on the success continuum for empires, if you will.
Fair enough.
I would suggest, though, that where we are now to some degree is natural, and it's natural because at the end of the Second World War, where we were the only major power to come out of the war in better shape than we went into it, suffered no significant loss of industry or anything like that. In fact, if you go look at the economic charts, the graphs are almost entirely straight up vertical. So we came out of that war as really at that point, even though the Soviet Union was strong and had a great military, from an economic standpoint, we were the powerhouse of the world, and there was no competition because it had all been destroyed. There was no way for us to go over the long term but down from that level of dominance, because eventually, and we helped rebuild the rest of the world, they were going to catch up to some degree. They were going to cut into that monopoly and that dominance. And if they didn't, we'd be in trouble. We wanted them to. That's what Marshall Plans and all that stuff was intended to help do. But inevitably, that meant that we weren't going to dominate to the same degree we did. And to a lot of people, that feels like somehow, it's almost like if you ever were making $1 million a year, then anything less than $1 million a year is a decline, even if that $1 million a year was unlikely to last and was temporary and you were at the height of your career. But it always feels like a step down, even if you're still comparatively wealthy, to make less than you made on your highs. The United States from about 1945 to 1955 is sort of on a power high, especially relative to the rest of the world. And it's difficult to see how people living in this era could view it any other way but sort of a decline. But without knowing how the next 100 years plays out, I'm not sure we can adequately figure that out.
So you're not ready to write the epitaph for the U.S. quite yet?
Well, I would say that there have been several times in U.S. history where we've made big changes to such a degree where you could classify them as eras. If you were writing a history book, you would say the era of Reconstruction, the era of industrialization, those big, wonderful, artificial, historical dividers. I think we're in a change period now that would form a new chapter, but I'm not sure that new chapter starts with the current president and the current times. I think, believe it or not, 100 years from now, it will be clear that we've been entering this age we're in right now for some time, and it hasn't been as noticeable to us as it's noticeable right now. Because, the seeds for where we are now were planted decades ago. We're starting to see what's growing now, and the fruit may not taste so good, but again, got to see how it works out by the time it's grown, harvested, and on our table.
I know that we got to let you go here in a minute, but when you say the seeds were sown, give us an example of what you mean.
Well, sure. I mean, for example, when people look to the modern Middle East and what a nightmare it is for us to deal with it, I mean, this is a perfect example of what decades and decades of political decisions have brought us. Now, could you have had a better outcome than we have in the Middle East? That you can never know. But we can certainly say that what we have, again, you could also look at this as a shakeout from the two world wars and the death of an old world, the beginning of a new one. But I mean, the modern Middle East is a perfect example of something where if you were born yesterday, or if you came of age yesterday and you're 20 years old and you really didn't know about what was going on in the world, but you're going to start paying attention today, there's no way to look at the Middle East today and understand how the heck you got there unless you're prepared to go just in recent history and look at the invasion of Iraq. And then if you're going to look at that, well, then you have to look at Saddam Hussein and the history of nationalist, Republican leaders, Republican being a strange word, but the secular nationalist leaders in that area from the 1950s. I mean, everything is connected to everything else. So there's no natural point to begin at. But without understanding that Donald Trump, what's that? It's a Marxist line. They were saying that you don't get to start with I'm paraphrasing, but you don't get to start with a clean slate in this life or when you're a leader. You inherit the world as it is, which is a product of all the decision making and random events and unforeseeable variables that acted upon it. So Donald Trump, for whatever he wants to bring to the table, is handed off the reality that he gets to work with, right? He doesn't get to start as fresh. And so he is as locked into certain realities as the person before him was and the person before him. And whatever he does while president will then have the effect of also hamstringing and locking in his successor. So everybody gets a turn at the table here to take over the card game that the person before them started. And this card game has been going on a long time, and you get stuck with the bad cards, and let's be honest, even the good hands, maybe the flawed strategies of your opponents who played in the seat across from you, and your predecessors who played on your team before you took over. Is that an analogy that visually makes sense?
Yes, that's a great analogy. You're great at that stuff. Listen, Dan, I wish we had longer with you. I know we have to let you go. I want to recommend everyone check out Hardcore History and also Common Sense with Dan Carlin. Common sense in a nutshell, like the elevator pitch for it is what? What is it? Just give people an idea of what Common Sense is.
It's a show that started off with me trying to analyze and talk about politics from the perspective of somebody who is neither a Democrat nor Republican. And I don't know what it's morphed into because I think I'm as confused by the times today as many of the rest of us are. So I'm not sure I have any elevator pitch currently. And if I was saying what I'm working on with that show, it's developing a new elevator pitch that makes sense in our current reality.
Well, I've enjoyed it. Those are great listens too. I didn't mean to, but it was hardcore history that hooked me. My brother first heard it and recommended it, and I've just been hooked ever since. Such a fan. I hope we'll get a chance to talk again. Dan Carlin, thanks for being with us today.
You're very kind. Thank you for having me on.
Subscribe to The Edge on iTunes or on Stitcher.
If you like this conversation, they're more like it at edge-show.com. We talk to all sorts of cool people. Check it out. Subscribe to our show through Stitcher and through iTunes. Support our show through your subscriptions and your positive reviews, and by liking our Facebook page, which I never mention, and by recommending our show to your friends. If you don't have friends, please go out and make more friends just so you can recommend our show. Thanks for your support.
Hey, everybody, why don't you do me a favor and like The Edge with Mark Thompson on Facebook? Yeah, that's going to bring in the kids.